Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. The Iron Maiden, one of the most infamous torture instruments of the Middle Ages. This device consisted of a metallic structure shaped like a sarcophagus, with the interior filled with sharp spikes. When the victim was placed inside and the door was closed, the spikes pierced the body without hitting vital organs, prolonging the suffering. The chevalet, or little horse in French, was a widely used torture instrument during the Middle Ages and the Inquisition. Its name comes from its resemblance to a wooden horse. The victim was forced to sit or ride on this structure, with their legs hanging and often with weights attached to their ankles. The purpose was to inflict extreme pain and cause bodily harm, often resulting in permanent injuries or even death. Used as punishment for crimes like blasphemy and theft, the torture coffin functioned as follows. Convicted individuals were forced to stay inside the mobile cell for days until death. Extremely tight, the cages were hung in public squares where the victims suffered exposure to the sun and attacks from animals that fed on the still-living body. The bronze bull, a method of execution used in ancient Greece, is attributed to the tyrant Phalaris of Agrigento. The condemned was placed inside a hollow metal bull, which was heated from below with fire until the victim was burned alive. To intensify the cruelty, openings transformed the screams into sounds resembling a bull's bellow. The torture saw, a macabre instrument used during the Middle Ages to punish and terrify. The victim was suspended upside down, ensuring blood flow to the brain to prolong consciousness while being sawed in half, usually starting at the groin. This cruel method was applied in cases of treason, heresy, or crimes considered heinous. The heretic's fork, an instrument of torture used during the Inquisition, especially between the 15th and 17th centuries. This device, fastened to the neck with a leather strap, had sharp ends pointing up and down, preventing any head movement. It was used to force confessions or as punishment for those accused of heresy. This brutal device was used to initiate the punishment of women, liars, and homosexuals. The pear-shaped apparatus was inserted into women's vaginas, homosexuals' anuses, and blasphemers' mouths. To make the 4 metal petals open, the victim only had to twist a screw. The pear could tear the flesh as it expanded and mutilate the orifices of those who received it. This engraving depicts a historical execution method known as trampling by elephants. Widely practiced in South and Southeast Asia, especially in India, this method involved the use of trained elephants to crush convicts, often under the command of a handler. This type of punishment served as a public spectacle, demonstrating both the ruler's power and the strength of the animals. This method, widely used in Europe, was known as the torture wheel, a medieval instrument used for brutal punishments. The victim was tied to the wheel, which rotated, while executioners broke their bones with hammers. Often, the mutilated body was left exposed on the wheel as a public warning. It was reserved for crimes deemed the most serious. Pillory bamboo torture was a cruel practice used during the wartime, particularly in Asia. In this method, the victim was tied above growing bamboo shoots. Bamboo, known for its rapid growth rate, would slowly pierce through the victim's body, causing severe injuries and an extremely painful death over the course of days. The neck collar of thorns, a torture instrument used in medieval Europe for punishment and humiliation. Made of metal and equipped with sharp spikes, it was fitted around the victim's neck, causing intense pain with every movement. This method was used both to discipline prisoners and to subjugate religious or political opponents. The waist chop was an extreme form of execution used in Imperial China, primarily during the Ming Dynasty, as punishment for serious crimes like treason. The victim was cut in half at the waist, resulting in either instant or prolonged death, depending on the executioner's skill. This method was a brutal demonstration of power and intimidation, often carried out publicly to reinforce imperial authority. This object is known as the thumbscrew, an instrument of torture widely used during the Middle Ages and later periods. It was designed to crush the thumbs or other fingers of the victim. The mechanism worked by turning the central screw, which gradually applied pressure, causing extreme pain, and in many cases, completely crushing the bones. This painting depicts the punishment known as dismemberment by horses, one of the most brutal executions in history. In this method, the victim's limbs were tied to horses that pulled in opposite directions until the body was completely torn apart. Practiced mainly in Europe and reserved for treason or crimes considered extreme, dismemberment served as a public spectacle to instill fear and obedience. Foot roasting was a torture method used in various periods, particularly during the Inquisition, to inflict extreme pain and extract confessions or information. The victim's feet were tied and exposed to hot coals or an intense heat source. The process caused severe burns, blisters, and, in prolonged cases, carbonized tissues. This method was notorious for its simplicity and effectiveness in causing immense suffering without immediate death. Poena culi was an extraordinarily cruel and rare punishment in ancient Rome applied to those convicted of parricide, killing a close relative, usually a father. The condemned was sewn alive into a leather sack alongside living animals considered ill omens such as a dog, a snake, a rooster, and a monkey. Once sealed, the sack was thrown into a river or the sea, ensuring a slow death by drowning and suffocation. This method of punishment involved forcing the condemned to fight to the death against a chosen animal, which could be a cow, a lion, a tiger, etc. Bestiaries were widely used in ancient Rome. The condemned were sent naked and without any kind of weapon to the arena and had to defend themselves against the chosen beast to try to save their lives. This practice was similar to that of gladiators, except they could use weapons like shields, spears, and swords, and were paid for the activity. This image shows what remains of a lead foot, an execution instrument used especially for forced drownings. Common in naval punishments and pirate trials, the condemned had weights fixed to their feet before being thrown into the sea. This method ensured a quick but cruel death and was also used to dispose of bodies in clandestine executions. The torture chair, an instrument of punishment used in medieval Europe to inflict extreme pain and extract confessions. Made of wood or iron, the chair was equipped with hundreds of sharp spikes that pierced the victim's body when they were tightly strapped in. Often the chair was heated to intensify the agony. This device was primarily used to punish those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or treason. This image shows the guillotine, one of history's most iconic execution devices. Introduced in France during the French Revolution in 1792, the guillotine was designed to provide a quick and humane execution. Its sharp blade descended rapidly, instantly severing the head from the body. During the Reign of Terror, led by Robespierre, the guillotine became a symbol of revolutionary justice, executing thousands, including nobles, politicians, and even revolutionary leaders. Pressing by weight was mainly used in Europe and the United States during the 16th and 17th centuries. The victim was laid on the ground with a board placed over their body, and heavy weights were gradually added until the condemned died from asphyxiation or internal crushing. This method was applied both for punishment and to force crime confessions. A famous case was that of Giles Corey, accused of witchcraft during the Salem trials in 1692, who resisted to the death without confessing. This punishment method became historically famous under the Inquisition tribunal. The stake was used as a humiliating means to burn the condemned publicly. Burnings were conducted collectively, with 3 or 4 people at a time. The condemned were forced to wear wet, sulfur-coated robes to prevent death from smoke inhalation. This ensured that the person would die by burning. In medieval Europe, boiling was sporadically used as a capital punishment for counterfeiters, poisoners, and traitors. The condemned was submerged in boiling liquid, causing a slow and excruciatingly painful death. The act served not only as punishment, but also as a warning to spectators. This image depicts the Judas cradle, a medieval torture instrument used to extract confessions or punish crimes. The victim was forced to sit on the sharp point of the structure, with the body's weight increasing the pain. Bound by ropes, they were unable to move, prolonging the suffering. The PK was a simple yet extremely painful torture method used primarily during the medieval period. The victim was forced to remain in an uncomfortable position, usually with one leg tied to a suspended rope while the other rested on the ground over a sharp stake or pointed object. The body's weight caused the foot to press against the stake, inflicting intense pain and injuries. A man wearing a cangue, a punishment device used in Imperial China and other Asian cultures. It consisted of a heavy wooden frame fastened around the condemned's neck, restricting movement and making it impossible to eat without assistance. The cangue was often used for public humiliation, with the person's name and crime written on the wood. The condemned were exposed in public places. Featured in the series Game of Thrones, rat torture was a cruel method used to extract confessions or punish individuals, recorded in various historical periods, especially during wars or brutal interrogations. In this method, a rat was placed inside a container, like a bucket, attached to the victim's body. The container was then heated with fire, forcing the rat to escape by digging into the victim's body, causing excruciating internal injuries. The breast ripper was a medieval torture instrument specifically designed for women accused of crimes such as adultery, blasphemy, or witchcraft. Made of iron, the device had claws that were heated and used to tear or mutilate the victim's breasts, causing extreme pain and often leading to death by infection or hemorrhage. This is a shame mask, an instrument of punishment and humiliation used mainly in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. These masks were made of iron and designed grotesquely or exaggeratedly to ridicule the wearer. They were used to publicly punish individuals accused of gossiping, slander, or other disruptive behaviors in society at the time. The practice of drowning women accused of witchcraft was common during witch trials in medieval and early modern Europe. The process often involved throwing the accused into a river or lake, tied or weighted down. The brutal logic behind this test was simple. If the woman floated, she was guilty of rejecting the pure waters. In such cases, she would be retrieved and executed by other means. This engraving depicts execution by impalement, one of the most brutal punishments in history. Used primarily during the Middle Ages and by Vlad the Impaler, the condemned were forced to sit on a sharp stake, which was then raised, slowly piercing the body. This method, designed to cause an agonizing death, served as a public warning, commonly seen in conflicts and political repression. The image illustrates the use of the pillory, a public punishment method widely employed in Europe and its colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries. The condemned were secured by the neck and hands in a wooden structure, immobilized and exposed to public humiliation. Spectators often mocked, threw objects, or insulted the condemned, increasing their psychological and physical suffering. One of the most utilized methods in Europe as punishment was execution with a single blow to the nape to behead the victim. Initially, this process was carried out by the executioner wielding a sword, but during the Middle Ages, axes and chopping blocks began to be used. Additionally, a headrest for the condemned was implemented to facilitate decapitation. Later on, this event had an upgrade, so to speak, in the late 1700s, gaining popularity due to the French Revolution. A device known as the thumbscrew, an instrument of torture used primarily during the Middle Ages and early modern era. The mechanism consisted of two wooden or metal bars equipped with sharp pins or nails, tightened by screws to crush the victim's fingers. This practice inflicted extreme pain, crushed bones and tissue, and often caused permanent deformities. Pitch capping was a form of torture used during the Irish Rebellion of 1798. In this method, a cap made of paper or fabric was filled with substances like boiling tar, resin, or pitch, and forcibly placed on the victim's head. The scalding material burned the skin and scalp, causing extreme pain and permanent scars. In some cases, the cap was ripped off, taking pieces of skin with it. This engraving illustrates the use of the strappado, a torture method widely employed during the Inquisition and medieval periods. The condemned was suspended by their wrists, usually tied behind their back, and abruptly hoisted upward, causing joint dislocations and extreme pain. In some variations, weights were added to the ankles to intensify the suffering. The torture rack was one of the most cruel and emblematic instruments of the Middle Ages and the Inquisition period. The victim was tied by their wrists and ankles to rolling bars, which slowly stretched the body. This process caused joint dislocations, muscle and tendon ruptures, resulting in excruciating pain and permanent damage. This engraving illustrates a common public punishment method in medieval Europe and later periods, where a man is confined in a barrel of shame, a practice applied to drunks or petty criminals who were forced to parade publicly. These punishments were not fatal, but served as forms of public humiliation to discipline and disgrace the condemned before society. The practice depicted in the image is known as knout, a brutal form of corporal punishment widely used in Tsarist Russia. It consisted of lashes delivered with an instrument called a knout, made of a long leather strap reinforced with metal wires or hooks at the end, capable of causing severe injuries or even death. Keelhauling was a brutal form of punishment practiced by sailors, especially pirates and European naval forces, during the 17th and 18th centuries. The condemned was tied with ropes and dragged under the hull of the ship, passing beneath the keel. This punishment was used as severe onboard discipline or as a slow, painful execution. Vestal virgins, priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta in ancient Rome, were required to maintain a vow of chastity during their 30 years of service. Breaking the vow of chastity or allowing the sacred fire to extinguish was considered a severe crime and an ill omen for the city. When accused of breaking their oath, the Vestals were often judged based on political accusations or conspiracies. If found guilty, they were brutally punished by being buried alive. The penal treadmill, or punishment treadmill, was a device used in prisons in England and British colonies during the 18th and 19th centuries. Prisoners were forced to continuously walk on steps connected to a wheel, which powered mechanisms like pumps or mills. Initially designed for productive labor, it was often used solely for punishment, producing no tangible output. The mask of shame, a device used during medieval and modern periods in Europe as a form of punishment and public humiliation. Women accused of gossiping, indecent behavior, or having a sharp tongue were often forced to wear these metal masks. Some versions included bells or internal spikes, making the use even more uncomfortable and degrading. The individual was paraded through public places, subject to community scorn and mockery. Field punishment number 1 was a form of military discipline used by the British Army during World War I. Soldiers convicted of insubordination, desertion, or other minor crimes were tied to a post or fixed object, often in exposed areas, for several hours a day. Though not explicitly torturous, the punishment was extremely degrading and painful, as soldiers were forced to remain immobile, often in uncomfortable positions. A man who was a victim of a popular punishment method, known as tar and feathering, widely practiced in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the United States and Europe. This practice, often used for public humiliation, involved pouring hot tar over the victim's body and then covering them in feathers. The goal was to cause pain and disgrace, marking the individual as a social outcast. The process was painful as the hot tar caused severe burns. The practice of beating as punishment is one of the oldest and most recurrent forms of discipline in history, used to assert authority, correct behavior, or inflict suffering. In military and judicial contexts, beatings were often employed as public punishment to reinforce discipline and intimidate others. Cliff executions were used in some cultures and historical contexts as a form of public punishment, often designed to provoke both fear and psychological impact among the population. Victims condemned for serious crimes were thrown from great heights, resulting in immediate death or prolonged suffering depending on the conditions of the fall. This photo depicts the electric chair, an execution method introduced in the late 19th century in the United States as an alternative to hanging. The condemned was strapped to the chair with electrodes placed on their head and legs. A high-voltage electric current was passed through the body, causing death by cardiac arrest and brain damage. The first recorded execution was that of William Kemmler in 1890. Yubitsume is a self-mutilation practice associated with the Yakuza, used as a punishment or a form of apology for serious failures within the organization. Literally meaning finger cutting, the ritual involves amputating the upper joint of one finger, usually the pinky, as a sign of remorse and submission. The origin of this practice dates back to Japan's feudal period when Yubitsume was used by gamblers and samurai as a punishment or demonstration of loyalty. An oubliette was a specific type of medieval cell designed as an almost inescapable underground prison. The term comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget, reflecting the fate of prisoners confined there. These structures were typically narrow pits in the ground, accessible only from a small opening above, where prisoners were lowered and left without hope of escape. Roman candle refers to a brutal practice during Emperor Nero's reign, in which Christians were tied to poles covered in flammable resin and burned alive. These human candles illuminated Nero's nighttime garden parties, particularly following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, for which Christians were unjustly blamed. This image shows the Judas bed, also known as the torture rack, widely used in the Middle Ages to obtain confessions or punish the accused. The device consisted of a structure with wooden rollers and ropes, where the victim was tied by the wrists and ankles. The executioners turned the rollers, gradually stretching the victim's body until joints dislocated or muscles tore. Scaphism was one of the most brutal punishments of antiquity, reportedly practiced in Persia. The victim was placed between two boats or inside a hollowed-out log, with their head, arms, and legs exposed. They were forced to ingest excessive amounts of milk and honey, causing diarrhea. In ancient Israel, Mosaic law prescribed the death penalty for 36 crimes. Cases of incest and adultery with a priest's married daughter resulted in execution by burning, but not in the traditional sense. The condemned was first strangled with a soft cord to minimize suffering. When their air ran out and agony was evident, molten lead was poured into their throat, concluding the punishment in a cruel and impactful manner. The act of condemning someone to be abused by wild animals until death was a brutal form of execution recorded during some historical periods, usually as punishment for extremely serious crimes or to publicly humiliate the victim. This practice, though rare, was used as a public spectacle in Roman arenas, where prisoners or convicts were exposed to wild animals such as lions, tigers, or even trained dogs to attack in a sadistic manner. The image depicts the practice of riding the stang, a form of public punishment in England and Scotland, common from the 17th to 19th centuries. In this scene, a person, typically accused of misconduct, is carried on a pole or beam while the surrounding crowd jeers and humiliates them. This method was used to punish immoral actions such as domestic abuse or inappropriate behavior as a means of social control. Lingchi, also known as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts, was a torturous execution method practiced in China. The condemned was tied to a post, and pieces of their skin and limbs were gradually removed one by one, typically culminating in a final cut to the heart or decapitation. In this medieval practice, known as sitting in the bathtub, the condemned was placed in a large barrel or tub filled with water, where they were publicly exposed until they wasted away. This method was primarily used to punish serious crimes or to humiliate, as the prisoner was fed while remaining there without hygiene, attracting flies and leading to decomposition while still alive.